Good morning, everyone. Welcome to church this morning. I'm Eugene, one of the pastors here, and some of you may know that I have one older sister who used to attend here, who recently got married and moved to the great state of Nevada. I actually don't know if it's a great state, but that's what people say. And this past year, my family and I got to spend some time out there to visit her and her husband and see some of the national parks. We saw the Grand Canyon and from there, we also drove to Southern California to see my wife's cousin's family, too, which basically means a 4 to 5 hour drive through miles and miles of desert. And if you've ever done a drive like that, you'll know that the scenery doesn't change all that much. It's just miles and miles and miles of boring, barren wasteland. And as we're coasting along these long stretches of highway at 65 miles an hour, I began to imagine, what life must have been like before cars could travel these distances in just a matter of hours. It would have taken days, weeks, even months of just patient walking. The mountains that line the horizon are beautiful at first, but they would seem endlessly far away, and you'd wonder if you were making any progress at all. And as modern people with our minute-to-minute attention spans, it might be hard to imagine that kind of slowness. Our minds demand constant stimulation and noise, but in the desert, there is nothing but sameness and silence. And somehow, when God delivered his people out of bondage in Egypt, it seems that this was his chosen setting to begin forming and shaping his people. God was bringing them to the promised land, but first they needed to pass through the desert. God brings his people into the desert not as punishment, but for their preparation, for their purification, and formation into the people of God. And so first, God had to get his people out of Egypt. But second, he needed to get Egypt out of his people. He needed to get their old ways of thinking and relating out of them. The desert is where he would teach them how to rest and how to trust. It's where they would begin to unlearn their old identities as slaves in Egypt and relearn a new identity as God's people. And perhaps we also need to journey through the desert in some ways as well. If you're just joining us, we're in the middle of a sermon series on the Exodus, which is the story of God delivering his people out of captivity into a new kind of community. And they were promised a land flowing with milk and honey, but perhaps what they didn't realize is that this was about much more than just the destination. It was about the journey. This was about much more than just getting from point A to point B or a long walk in the desert. It was about God revealing his love and care for them and for the Israelites to learn to trust and rely on him. God delivered them. God saved them. God provided for them. God was their shade from the sun during the day by cloud, and he was their warmth at night by pillar of fire. And they had just witnessed God's power parting the waters and destroying the Egyptian army who was pursuing them. And you can imagine those first few days must have been incredible. They must have been so full of joy, God is with us. Man, he's awesome. We are free. And they sang songs of deliverance. But after a few days, the songs started to die down. After a few weeks of walking in the desert, I'm sure they started to get a little uncomfortable and anxious, and they started to complain. Are we there yet? I'm bored. What are we going to eat? How come there's no Wi-Fi here? Well, not exactly, right? But in Exodus 16:2, it says, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. Remember, it was slavery, right? But you brought us out into this desert to die. You're going to starve us all to death. Yes, they are being overly dramatic. But walking around the desert for weeks on end is not what they imagined God's salvation to look like. Have you ever been there? When life doesn't live up to your expectations, when relationships are unfulfilling, marriage is difficult, and work feels futile. All of us fantasize in some way about our circumstances being different or better in some way. We might feel dissatisfied with our jobs, our friends, our spouses, our incomes, our living situation, our bodies, or even our church. When your life is not going the way you think it should, has your heart ever grumbled and said something like, if only my spouse knew how to love me better. If only I had more money. If only I had a job I really enjoyed. If only my kids would listen to me. If only my parents would listen to me. If only I had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. If only I lived somewhere else. If only I was smarter or more attractive. If only I were a better Christian. If only, how do you fill in that blank? We want our lives to be perfect. We want to be in control. We want things to go the way we want for our fulfillment and our happiness. And I'm sure that's what the Israelites wanted too. So they grumbled and they argued with one another. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. You're walking too slow. Perhaps most of all, they complained about what God had and hadn't done for them. And so, how did God respond? What did God do? God graciously provided. Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning you will see his glory because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? Who are we, Moses and Aaron, that you should grumble against us? They said, you will know that it was the Lord who gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. God gave the Israelites manna, which was bread, apparently, that appeared on the ground with the dew every morning. And as if that weren't enough, quail would just come and cover the campground every evening. Every day they had manna for breakfast and quail for dinner, and it was all free. They didn't have to earn it or work for it. Pretty good deal. And why did he do this? Well, two times in verses 6 and 8, he says, you will know that it was the Lord. That's his point here. It was so they would know this is no random coincidence. It was the Lord. But this miraculous provision came with some instructions. They were only to collect what they needed for that day. Any extra they collected would rot and stink up the whole camp. It would make Moses very angry, right? I would be angry too. And this was so that they would be reminded daily that it was the Lord who delivered them. It was the Lord who sustains them. And that's why Moses says to them, hey, you want to complain about the food? Just know who the chef is. You're not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. Trust me, you don't want to send this plate back. God's point is this: all this is me. Everything you have is from my hand. All you have is mine. So when you grumble and argue with one another, you grumble and argue against me. When you complain about what you have and what you don't have, you complain to me. Now think about what that means for our lives, for our jobs, our finances, our families, or our marriages. Just like God provided manna and quail for the Israelites to sustain them on this journey, how might we see our lives, our circumstances, as God's provision to us, not as the destination, but as sustenance for the journey? How might we see that everything we have, however imperfect, are free gifts from God's hand? See, unlike their lives as slaves, the Israelites didn't have to do anything to earn or work for God's provision. They just woke up every morning and it was there. Every morning I wake up with breath and life that's given to me as a gift, free of charge. I get up from my bed in my home with my family to running water and electricity. I eat. I take my kids to school. I drive to work in my car. I'm given the sky and the sun and the trees. I'm given the people I work with and the presence of God all around me. I go through my day with countless blessings that I did not work for. I received it all for free. And maybe this is what Paul means in Ephesians 5:20 when he says, always giving thanks to God the Father for everything. Whenever I'm tempted to grumble and complain about how things in my life aren't the way they're supposed to be, I always remember this quote from Paula Darcy. She says, God comes to us disguised as our life. How would the way we see our life circumstances change if we knew God was somehow disguised in it? That means even in the things I don't like or don't have or don't understand, to see God in it, working through them for my good. It's important to note that God didn't give his people filet mignon or caviar to eat, right? Nor did he give them an endless variety of food. It wasn't a 5-course meal or buffet. It was just manna and quail every day. The Bible says the manna tasted like wafers made with honey. And although that might sound delicious at first, imagine eating that every day, every single meal for years, for 40 years. They had fresh manna, baked manna, boiled manna, manna toast, manna soup, manna salad, manna cakes. They had quail sandwiches, quail stew, quail burgers, quail kebabs, quail McNuggets. You get the idea. Kids are like, manna casserole again? The point is, manna and quail were never meant to satisfy their every craving. That was not the point. Manna and quail were meant to be good enough. God didn't provide the Israelites with huge stockpiles of food that would last them for weeks either. He gave them just enough for each day, every day. It says some gathered much and some gathered little, but amazingly, no one had too much and no one had too little. Everyone gathered just as much as they needed. Apparently, God thought that what they had for the day was enough. Didn't Jesus teach us to pray, give us today our daily bread? Think about the first thing you see in the morning. Maybe it's your bedroom or the light coming in through your window or your cat. For me, it's my wife, Alice. And it's amazing. But when I wake up in the morning, she's just there. Right? I didn't have to do anything for her to be there. She just appears like manna. Right? And interestingly, I don't wake up to a new wife every morning. It's always the same person. She is God's daily provision for me. She is an amazing gift and blessing in my life. She's not perfect, but she is good enough for today. Right? I'm going to start a new line of Valentine's Day cards. It just says, you are good enough for today. Right? I know that doesn't sound very romantic, but I promise you, It's what real over 20 years of marriage love really looks like. It's to learn how to love and accept and cherish her as she is, not as she should be. As a husband, I know I have a long way to go, but I hope I'm good enough for her for today, too. Maybe you feel disappointed that your spouse isn't as considerate as you would like, or as understanding, or as spiritual, or whatever. You might be right. Maybe they aren't everything you hope them to be, but can you see your spouse as good enough for today? When you feel dissatisfied with your job, or your search for a job, or with the work you have to do at home, can you see whatever tasks you have to do, whatever tasks you have before you, as good enough for today? When you wish you could be a better parent, or more accomplished in your career, or even a better Christian, can you remind yourself that you are good enough for today? Our lives are not meant to be perfect. They're just meant to be good enough for today. That's why Jesus tells us, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or drink or wear. He says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. All these things will be given to you as well. Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. What if we are so busy pursuing the abundant life that always seems just out of reach that we are missing the one God's already provided for us today? I've heard Pastor John Murray once say, the secret to a happy life is low expectations, right? And he may have said that jokingly, but there's some real wisdom and truth in that statement. As many have said before, expectations are disappointments or resentments waiting to happen. Our expectations have a powerful impact on how we experience reality. I want us all to remember that Jesus Christ, who was God, came in the flesh to live a perfect human life. Yet his life was filled with imperfection. Think about what life must have been like for him, right? He wasn't born into a world of modern conveniences and AC and, right? Life was hard. Life was uncomfortable. He was homeless. He lost loved ones. He suffered injustice, betrayal. He was even abandoned by his closest friends in his most vulnerable moment. The Bible says he was a man familiar with suffering and pain. If Jesus experienced all these things, should we somehow expect our lives to be perfect and pain-free? For those of us who probably all of us, who can't help but grumble and complain sometimes about our lives, we might need to pass through the desert. See, the desert is more than just a place to pass through. It signifies an essential part of the spiritual journey. Surely there are times in our lives that are like living in a land flowing with milk and honey, when blessings are plentiful. But there are also times when we feel like we're just wandering. Seasons of spiritual dryness that feel long and tired. Sometimes when you have nothing to rely on but God. And if you find yourself in a place like that, don't be alarmed. Don't be discouraged. The desert is the place where faith gets tested and refined, a place where we find out who we are when things don't go our way. And it's the place where we find out who God is. See, desert trees have deeper roots because water is scarce. The roots need to go deeper to find water. In the same way, the desert is where you might meet God in deeper ways than you thought possible. The desert teaches us to shed our expectations and demands so that we can accept and live in reality. And living in reality always requires honesty, courage, and above all, faith. Because reality can be hard, and it is always imperfect, but it's the only place we can actually find God. The problem is we're often stuck living in illusions and fantasies, chasing mirages of success and safety and comfort. Or we might imagine a spiritual life that is nothing but victory and a constant state of bliss. We can only find God in what is, not what should be. In fact, we often miss God because we're too busy trying to be God and be in control of everything. The desert is where we learn to let go of control, we empty ourselves, and we surrender to God. The desert, it reminds us how weak and vulnerable we are. It forces us to embrace our limits and our humanity. But it's also where we learn to accept and trust in God's provision. Only then can we gratefully, wholeheartedly receive the full life God has for us. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, Christians fled the decadence of the Roman Empire to the Middle East and to Egypt. They sought simplicity and silence and solitude and basic sustenance. Why? What can we possibly find in the desert where there's nothing around for miles? What do we find when there's nothing but ourselves and God? The answer is we find ourselves and we find God. These desert mothers and fathers and countless others, they willingly and passionately chose the path of the desert. They pursued God through emptying and surrender and found God in simplicity and stillness. Blaise Pascal wrote, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." I would add that it's the problem with our spiritual lives as well. In the modern world, our spiritual lives often just mirror the overbusy and noisy culture we live in. We become addicted to constant distraction and stimulation and entertainment. I feel it every time I wait in line at the grocery store. Right? Do not look at your phone. Do not look at your phone. Right? Maybe some of you feel it while you're sitting in church listening to sermons. I see you. You're not taking notes, right? I bet most of you parents of young children have the song Baby Shark playing in the background of your minds right now. And if you didn't before, you do now. In our spirituality, we have become driven by activity and study and lots of talking about God or at God, lots of doing, thinking, and feeling, but not enough silence and stillness. Of course, doing, thinking, and feeling things aren't bad, but we shouldn't always assume they'll lead us any closer to God. In fact, doing, thinking, and feeling can often be ways that we avoid having to deal with God directly. But in the desert, it's just you and God. There's nothing to hide behind, nothing to fill the empty space in between. Just simple, naked, sometimes raw encounter with the God who is already and always present. In contrast, I remember attending my very first worship conference when I was in college. Back then, contemporary worship was still relatively new, so when I got to experience a big venue full of people with an awesome band and, stage lights and projection, it was exhilarating. I experienced God in ways I'd never encountered before. But a funny thing happened when I returned to my church the next Sunday. Our church did a pretty good job, I think, at worship and music, But we didn't have professional musicians or the energy and excitement of a worship concert. And so worship, to be honest, felt a little flat that morning. Kind of a downer. Which is strange because surely the same God who showed up at that conference was the same God who was with us on Sunday morning. Something in me had changed. In a way, the conference kind of spoiled me. Having multi-sensory worship experiences with awesome music can be a blessing. They can amp us up for God and make us feel great. But what we might not realize is that they can also, at the same time, make us feel numb, even desensitize us to God, too. We can become overstimulated. I am not against worship concerts. I think they're great. For some, going to a conference or a concert can be like finding an oasis in the desert. The problem is when we become overly dependent on feelings and sensory experiences in our relating to God. If we are constantly seeking bigger and better experiences of God, first of all, that's very hard to maintain. And second, we might forget that a lot of the spiritual journey takes place in the desert. That God is in the quiet stillness and even in awkward silences too. Henri Nouwen wrote, "The wisdom of the desert is that the confrontation with our own frightening nothingness forces us to surrender ourselves totally and unconditionally to the Lord Jesus Christ." The paradox of the spiritual life is that often it's the moments when we feel like we have nothing that we become most aware of Christ. We need the desert. It purifies us. It teaches us to trust and accept. The good news is you don't have to go to a literal desert. Walking with God through the desert can mean just a few simple things any of us can do anywhere. So first of all, are you a slave, a captive to noise and activity or productivity? The antidote is silence and stillness. I find that my commute to and from work is the perfect desert moment in my day. I can't really work or be very productive. My immediate temptation might be to turn on the news or some music to fill the silence. But as a discipline, I've learned to savor the silence and to be with God and be with myself. And I know that that can sound terrifying to some of us, but it's so desperately what we need. So where can you practice silence and stillness in your day? Where and when in your week can you strip away the noise and activity so that you can just be with God? You can go for a walk in the middle of the day, turn off your phone at a certain time in the evening, change your routine when you wake up or go to bed to include some silence and solitude. Second, how might you see your life and everything in it as good enough for today? How might you let go of dissatisfaction and judgment and embrace a deeper contentment and acceptance of all things? Acceptance doesn't mean you have to like it. It just means that you're surrendered. You're surrendered to God and you are walking in faith, especially when the way is unclear or uncomfortable or scary. But acceptance also opens the way to gratitude. How might we let go of expectations and live in our present reality? I would like you to take a moment right now to think about your life. What are you frustrated about? What are you dissatisfied with? Think about all the good and the bad that make up your life right now. And now I would like all of us to say out loud together, it's good enough for today. Say it. It's good enough for today. Say, I'm good enough for today. Turn to someone next to you and say, you're good enough for today. I know that might not sound like the most inspiring message, but it is the key to contentment, peace, and freedom. Third, if you absolutely must do something, here, I'll throw you a bone, okay? You might consider some spiritual practices that Dallas Willard calls the disciplines of abstinence, which are ways that we deny ourselves from things we want or even need in order to make space for God. So in addition to silence and solitude, which I've already mentioned, there's fasting, going without food, or for some of us, media, for a period of time. There's the discipline of frugality or simplicity, saying no to ourselves, saying no to spending on ourselves for a season so that we can combat our own self-centeredness and practice generosity. There's chastity and serving in secret and sacrifice and submitting to others, and I'm sure many more. But in all of these, discipline and denial are ways we enter a desert place within our souls without actually having to drive to Nevada. If we don't deny our desires once in a while, we become our desires. If we don't withdraw from the world once in a while, we become like the world. So the point is to strip away the things we depend on or get distracted by so that we can rest in and be with God. And I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, this is an essential part of the spiritual journey. Finally, of course, we all need to practice Sabbath. We need rest. And there's one more essential lesson we can learn from manna in the desert. God instructed the Israelites to collect their daily bread, but on the sixth day to collect 2 days' worth, right? Enough for the seventh day. And God commanded them, tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest. So bake what you want, boil what you want, save whatever's left, and keep it until the morning. He's saying, do everything you need to do beforehand, but on the seventh day, everybody rests. And in order to really appreciate this, we have to remember where the Israelites are coming from, right? They were slaves. Slaves don't get days off. They were captives to this never-ending toil and oppression. So as this command is being given, I can imagine everyone just doing a double take. Wait, what? Did he say rest? But we're slaves. Like, we don't get to rest. What kind of God is this who commands his people to take it easy? Rest. They get to be human. God is saying, you are no longer slaves. You are free. I am your God. You are my people. I will do the work for you. And I'm sure some people stood around and didn't know what to do at first, right? I mean, what is this weird feeling? I have no bricks to make, no pyramids to build. What do I do? What do you have when you have a whole day off in the desert with nothing around you and no work to do? You have each other. You're supposed to be, I'm talking to you too, you're supposed to be the people of God. You're supposed to have dinner and laugh and play games. You're supposed to enjoy and love one another. In this way, the Sabbath was making them into a new people, a free people. And that's who we're supposed to be too. So many of us need to hear this. I often need to remind myself that I am not a slave. I am not a machine. I'm human. I have limits. I need to remember I don't need to maximize every moment. I need margin. I'm not a slave. I'm free. I can slow down and be present. I can live my life in God and not just in a rush. So how can you rearrange your week, rearrange your priorities so that you can intentionally carve out time for rest and relationships? Our jobs, our finances, our relationships, even our churches were never meant to fulfill our every longing or expectation. They're just manna and just quail, daily sustenance for the journey. It's good enough for today. The desert teaches us that God provides, God sustains, and that God is enough. Perhaps you might ask yourself, whatever your circumstance or whatever your situation, is God good enough for you today? Don't think about tomorrow or yesterday. Is God good enough for you today? I want to invite you to be with God in silence and stillness for just a few moments, pondering that question, and then Abby will lead us in confession and communion. Is God good enough for you today?